The 2023 Formula 1 season ended with Max Verstappen winning the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. This was his 19th win of the season, and it was Red Bull's 21st win of the season. Now, this video is not about Max Verstappen specifically or Red Bull. This video is primarily about the drivers and how they fared in the 2023 F1 season. Now, if you're a subscriber or a repeated viewer, you might be aware that this season, after every race, we did the driver ratings. Now, for a lot of them, I was able to make the videos. For others, I was unable to. Apologies for that. Having said that, I've maintained a record of driver ratings after every race of the season. And in this video, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to share the top 10 cumulative scores, as in the top 10 drivers of the 2023 F1 season once we take the average of the driver ratings of each and every race. So without further ado, let's jump straight to it and let's take a look at who are the top 10 drivers of the 2023 F1 season. So before we proceed, just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, hit that like button, and if you are new to the channel, please subscribe as well. It does not cost you anything. And now let's get back to the video. Now at number 10, we have Pierre Gasly. And when we take a look at the average cumulative rating for Gasly throughout the 2023 F1 season, it's 7.05. Now, for Gasly, the season was, well, he took a few races to get used to the Alpine. Once he was able to do that, he was more or less competitive with Ocon. And maybe you can say in the second half of the season, he had the edge over his teammate. When we take a look at the races where he did well, the podium in Zandvoort stands out. Also, the races in Austin, it was quite impressive, as well as the race in Brazil. Now, if we talk about the races where he did not do as well, arguably the weekend in Baku, where the lack of running cost the entire team, it was not that good for Gasly. And the weekend in Canada as well, it was not as impressive. Now, this is the graph and the pattern of driver ratings for Gasly throughout the season. And as you can see, once he reaches the midway part, it seems to pick up a bit as compared to how he fared earlier in the season. So yes, all in all, Gasly finds himself 10th in the driver rankings for the 2023 F1 season. Next up in P9, we had Esteban Ocon, who had the overall rating for the 2023 season at 7.14. Now, in terms of good weekends and the bad ones, Ocon's better weekends came earlier in the season, where he was probably more in line with the car. He struggled a bit midway through the season and then slightly recovered at the end of it. When we talk about Ocon, I think the weekend in Monaco stands out because arguably it was a flawless weekend because Alpine, he probably overachieved with that car in that particular race. And then even the races in Vegas and Saudi were quite impressive. Then you talk about weekends where he did not do as well. You have to say the weekend in Zandvoort where Gasly scored a podium, Ocon was nowhere. The US GP was not as impressive if you take a look at the sprint and the race overall. And even the weekend in Silverstone, it was not up to par. Now let's take a look at the pattern of driver ratings throughout the season for Esteban Ocon. And I think you can see the pattern is quite clear. Earlier in the season, he was doing well. Then he had a bit of a slump midway through the season. And then in the end, he was again able to recover a bit with the races in Vegas where he performed quite well. Overall, in the 2023 F1 season, Ocon finds himself 9th in the rankings. Now next up, in 8th, we have Carlos Sainz. Carlos Sainz had an overall average rating of the 2023 season at 7.18. When we talk about Carlos, it was a bit of a weird season. He was there or thereabouts in the beginning. He was making the most of errors from Charles Leclerc and getting the upper hand. Midway through the races in Italy as well as in Singapore, he suddenly found something that arguably Leclerc lagged at that point in time, and he had some brilliant races. Then again, near the end of the season, Sainz started to trail away, and it was quite obvious in the results as well, as ultimately at the end of the season, Leclerc was able to outscore him. Now, if we take a look at the races where he did well, as I said earlier, the races in Italy where he finished P2 and the race in Singapore where he won, they were quite impressive, arguably one of the best drives of the season. Then if we take a look at the races where he was unable to do as well, arguably the race in Abu Dhabi, where he had a stinker and arguably caused Ferrari P2 in the championship. And then there were the races in Baku and Australia as well. Overall, it was a decent season. It was great in spurts. In the end, you can see even in the pattern of driver ratings throughout the season that there are parts of the season where Sainz seems to do well, and then there are others where he just fades away. So yes, more or less a season where he finds himself 8th in the driver rankings for the 2023 F1 season. Now next up in P7, I have George Russell. And if you take a look at the overall average rating, he had the rating of 7.34. Now, George's season, overall, if you take a look back, he would be very disappointed because he lost quite a few chances either due to bad luck or due to his own faults. Having said that, there were races where he did quite well. His race in Miami was impressive. The Abu Dhabi weekend was very impressive. Then the race earlier in the season in Saudi Arabia was quite impressive from him as well. Then we talk about the races where he did not do as well. Again, there were quite a few. The weekend in Spa stands out. He was nowhere close to Lewis. Arguably, when we talk about George, there's one thing that stands out more when you compare it with Lewis. And the thing is that the peaks and troughs of the two drivers match. As in, whenever an upgrade is introduced, the start of it tends to work towards Lewis, and then in the later phases, it tends to come more towards George. And that was obvious throughout the season. And that is where you see the drops in performance for George as well. Now, if we take a look at the pattern of the driver ratings for the season for George, you can see it quite clearly. Near Monaco, it takes a dip. Then it will take a dip again near Austin. And these are the 2 points where Mercedes introduced a major upgrade. And that is something that would hurt George in the long run if he does not show the adaptability that his teammate did. Overall, I'd say George had a disappointing season. He's probably a top 5 driver, but he did not show it this time around, and he finds himself 7th in the driver rankings for the 2023 F1 season. Now, next up in P6, we have Alex Albon, who has the average cumulative rating of 7.41. Now, arguably for me, he was the surprise of the season. He showed a lot of skills in terms of leadership that I did not think he even had. He had a very impressive season, especially if you compare it with Logan Sargent. And maybe quite a few times you can say that he wasn't able to shine because he was limited by the car under him. There were quite a few races where Williams was under par, and that did compromise Albon's weekend more often than not. Having said that, a very strong season, quite a few standout races for him as well. His weekend in Canada was impressive. His weekend in Italy, superb. So was a weekend in Zandvoort. And similarly, there were a couple of races where he would feel a bit disappointed. The crash in Australia is something that stands out because he was on his way to score points. Still, if you take a look at the pattern of driver ratings for Albon, they are more or less consistent. You won't see too many peaks and you won't see too many off weekends. So with a better car, he might be able to probably express himself even more in the coming seasons. So yes, for now, he gets a ranking of 6 for the 2023 F1 season. Maybe in a better car, he might have been able to showcase a lot more and maybe find himself higher in the ranking as well. Now, next up in P5, I have Lewis Hamilton with an average rating of 7.43. Now, this might be a bit of a surprise for quite a few, and I can understand that as well. First of all, if you take a look at the races where Lewis did well, there were the races in Austin where he was very impressive. Then there was a race in Mexico as well where he did a brilliant job. So was a race in Barcelona as well. Now, at the same time, there were races where Lewis was, something happened that we saw a massive slump. The slump was there this weekend as well in Abu Dhabi. It did not perform as well as the car was capable of delivering. Similarly, there were other races as well, like the one in Qatar. He had a crash with George that ended the race prematurely. Even the race in Austria wasn't the best from him. And even though there are many that might feel that he could have had a higher ranking, the thing is, when you take a look at the pattern of his driver ratings, you see that there is a lot of zigzag, as in a lot of ups and downs throughout his season. Because of this, even though his peaks were quite impressive, there were quite a few race weekends where he was average at best, and that cost him in the long run. So yes, in my view, Lewis Hamilton finds himself 5th in the driver rankings for the 2023 F1 season. Next up at number 4, I have Fernando Alonso with the average rating of 7.64. Now, when the season began, I did not expect, even though I was hoping, I did not expect Fernando Alonso to have such a season where he had so many podiums and even contested for a win in a couple of races. I did not expect that. Well, thanks to Aston Martin, it did happen. Now, when you talk about the races where he excelled exceptionally, I think the races still in Zandvoort and Brazil stand out for me. His race in Monaco was also quite impressive because, at least to an extent, he kept Max within reach, even though it was still a lost cause. Now, when you talk about the races where Alonso did not do well, I think it kind of coincided with Aston Martin's drop in form. When you talk about the races in Singapore, he did not do as well. Mexico was poor in my view, and similarly Spain was a bit of a joke. I really don't know what the hell he was doing there, where he did not even make an attempt to overtake Lance Stroll. So yes, overall he gets a rating of 7.64. And if you take a look at the pattern of driver ratings for Alonso, there's something that becomes visible. He had a great start to the season, and then there was a certain dip in between post Austria. Now, there were a few races where he did not perform to the level where we were used to seeing him. But then again, from the Dutch Grand Prix, Alonso kind of regrouped and he did a much better job to end the season on a high. So, yes, overall, in terms of driver rankings this season, Alonso finds himself fourth in the standings. Now, next up, we have Lando Norris in third with a driver rating average of 7.66. Now, for Lando Norris, the season started, well, not on a great note because the car was nowhere. However, since the upgrade in Austria, the car was very impressive, and Norris expressed himself as well as he could have. Throughout the season, if we take a look at the races where he did well, even before the upgrade in Austria, he had a very impressive weekend in Australia as well. And other than that, there were races in Britain and Brazil where Lando truly showed his class. For Lando as well, there were a few weekends where he was just not up to the mark. The weekend in Saudi Arabia where he had a crash in qualifying, or the weekend in Vegas where he once again crashed out of the race, or probably the weekend in Spain where he had a collision with Lewis Hamilton at the start of the race. Now, there were a few races where he did not do as well. However, if you take a look at the pattern of performance from Norris, what we can see here is that there's a certain level of consistency. Other than a few off weekends where he was just not up to the mark or made a mistake, you can see that there is a certain level of consistency in his ratings as well. And this tends to contribute to see him at third in the driver rankings for the 2023 F1 season. Now at number 2, we have Charles Leclerc with an average rating of 7.68. Now when we talk about Charles, it was a season of ups and downs. He had quite a few races where he was arguably not in the best of forms. However, what worked for him was the fact that when he had strong weekends, they were very impressive. And they were the weekends where he put the car in places where it really did not deserve to be in. Some of his best weekends include the pole position and the podiums in Baku, a spectacular weekend from his side, and then the last 2 weekends in Vegas as well as in Abu Dhabi, where pre-race you did not expect Ferrari to do this well. Well, in my view, even I was initially surprised to see Leclerc this high, but when you look at the entire season, what you see is, even though he has his off weekends in Australia, in Zandvoort, in Miami, there are weekends where Charles outshines the car and tends to get a lot of maximum ratings for his driving over a weekend. And that is why, if you take a look at his driver ratings for the entire season, the pattern is quite clear. There are quite a few lows, but his highs are quite impressive. And that is what ultimately helps him finish second in the driver ratings for the 2023 F1 season. Now finally at number 1, we have, well, no prizes for guessing. We have Max Verstappen at number 1. And yeah, it has been a very impressive season. You can arguably say that other than the races in Singapore, as well as maybe to an extent the race in Baku, the driver has been on form. I think this has to be one of the greatest seasons when a driver has put together in terms of statistics. So yes, in terms of average rating, he gets a rating of 9.34. I do think a lot of it, this higher number, I think it has to do with the fact that he had arguably the fastest car on the grid. The number might be a bit lower when he has a little bit more of a competition. The mistakes might creep in as well, because no driver is perfect, even when they are Max Verstappen. So yes, still I don't think there was much of a doubt that Max has probably been the best driver of the 2023 F1 season. Now arguably there are a few fans that would be unhappy looking at some of the rankings. Now for me, at least in my view, I think some of the things that stand out in these rankings is, well, I think what we need to take a look at is the average rating for second till fourth. You have Charles Leclerc at 7.68 and he's second, and you have Fernando Alonso at 7.64 and he's fourth. The difference after 22 races is just 1 point between these 3 drivers. If Lando had 1 more point, he would be second. If Alonso had 2 more points, he would be second. And that is probably something I've always said, if you guys have listened, that at the end of the day, what we have right now in F1 is probably the most talent-rich grid throughout the history. Be it Lando, be it Charles, be it Alonso, be it Lewis, be it George as well. These are the drivers that you can bank on. If they have the right car, they will end up winning the championship. So yes, the rating and the rankings, they can vary a bit from here and there, but 1 point remains. At the end of the day, these drivers are truly elites, and in the right car, they can work the magic. Now, these were my views and these are my rankings for the top 10 drivers. What do you guys think? Do let me know in the comment section. Thanks for watching and see you next time.